Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land we're broadcasting from tonight. We pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. Welcome to UQ Talks, where we ignite your curiosity with fascinating presentations from the brightest minds from within your university community. I'm Tegan Taylor. I'm a journalist with ABC Radio National, and I'm your host and moderator for this series. And with all eyes currently on Paris, we all want to know how Brisbane can play the games just right when it's our time to host in 2032. So joining me in the studio tonight is a lineup of panellists here to discuss how we can bring our diverse Brisbane community on the planning journey to create a livable city for future generations, and discuss how past Olympics and Paralympics influence the proposed Brisbane cityscape. Before I introduce our speakers, a reminder that you can be part of the discussion tonight by asking your questions using the Q&A button on your screen. This has been one of our highest subscribed UQ Talks. We have had hundreds of questions submitted in advance. I'm going to do my best to get through as many as I can as part of the discussion, but don't let that stop you from adding your question to the fray, because we will have a Q&A section at the end. Add those questions using that box. Now, unfortunately, Stephanie Wyeth, who was on the list tonight, is unable to attend our talk, but jumping in for Stephanie is UQ alum Peter Hyland, who is an industry fellow in the School of Architecture, Design and Planning here at UQ. Peter is regarded as one of the most respected urban land use strategists within the Asia Pacific region, and currently sits on the board for Stadiums Queensland and Urban Utilities. We also have two esteemed UQ academics, Professor Linda Cheshire, head of the school at the School of Social Science in UQ's Faculty of Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences. Professor Cheshire is an internationally renowned sociologist focusing on areas of community, neighbourhoods and housing. And Professor John Quiggin is Professorial Research Fellow at the School of Economics in UQ's Faculty of Business, Economics and Law. Professor Quiggin is a research economist and commentator on Australian economic policy. I honestly can't think of three more qualified people to join this discussion tonight. And let's dive in, to use a pun from the first week of the Olympics, or let's take our marks maybe this week. We heard in July 2021 that Brisbane was going to be the site of the Olympics. A lot of fanfare, a lot of hype. Now with the Paris Olympics underway, the hype is very real. Take us back through what the sell was for Brisbane and Southeast Queensland for the 2032 Olympics. And I might start with you, Peter.
Thanks, Tegan, and thanks for the opportunity to be here and to step in for my good friend, Steph Wyeth. The sell originally, Tegan, was very much about, because if you think back to where the bid started, it was from the SEQ Council of Mayors. So it was this idea of a concept that this would be a regional bid. So it wouldn't just be a one city bid. Obviously, Brisbane is the big entity in the activity. But the initial discussions were always about as a regional bid between all the local authorities of Southeast Queensland. And that's the genesis of where it stayed. And where it still is today. I mean, there's obviously been a lot of discussion and these things evolve over time. But there is still a lot of activity about the opportunities for the broader region to evolve. And there's still obviously things to determine there. But that was the genesis, was that this was going to be a regional games centred around Brisbane, but with a benefit and an opportunity for the broader region, and then also permeating statewide and nationally, obviously, but with a less direct sort of emphasis. So that was my reading and sort of involvement back in some of the early days of around the 2010 or earlier, when some of the thinking started about this.
Linda, a lot of the discussion was around making it inclusive games. What could that look like, or what was it pitched to look like?
I think the notion of inclusivity comes in two ways. And one is the games itself and ensuring that it is inclusive of gender diversity. And I think in Paris, for example, they're really proud that the Olympics has gender parity and inclusive, bringing along the Paralympians as well. But inclusivity also means that we need to think about some of the detail And I think if we look at the Paris Olympics, for example, there are broader socio-political issues going on that make the Games less inclusive than I think we would like. And so, for example, we've seen debates around, women wearing religious headgear in the Olympics. There have been debates that have been unpleasant and, misinformation and disinformation about transgender people in sport. There have also been issues going on around the world right now around, kind of anti-Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, and of course riots in the UK about anti-immigration. So if we think about inclusivity, we need to make sure the Games themselves are inclusive, and that's something to be proud of. But the Games go on within a broader social and political context, and we need to think about what that broader context is and find ways of making sure that people are included in broader society as well as in the event itself.
And John, what was the economic promise of the 2032 pitch?
Well, I think a bunch of promises are usually made for major events of this kind, and those promises usually aren't delivered. So there's claims, if you look at the regular sporting events we have, claims that they'll put the city on the map, which there's possibly some truth of for the Olympics, but certainly for most of the events that go on, there's nothing to that. The idea that there'll be a very large and useful built legacy, I think, was very prominent early on, but we pretty clearly realised that that wasn't going to be the case. And this has been a very typical pattern of excitement followed by disillusion, but followed by almost invariably a really good time when the Games actually happen. And in my view, that's where the big economic benefits will be. They'll be simply from the fact that people in Brisbane and South East Queensland have, for most people, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to go to the Olympic Games. That's something which the average person can never afford to do, and which we will have. And most of them will be spending a lot of money on it, and that's probably where our big benefits will be. Briefly, the putting the city on the map, it worked for Barcelona. It may work for us. In most cases, they're in major cities that have been on the map for an awful long time.
Paris,
London. London.
People have heard of it.
Yeah, I don't imagine anybody going to London is thinking about the Games that they had some years ago. We are in that sense a little like Barcelona, a city that is obscure but on the up, so we might get a modest benefit from that. But really, the big benefit from it, it's coming. We should look forward to it, book our tickets, enjoy the Games.
It does feel like a lot of the discussion about sort of moving on from the original sort of announcement and bid, it becomes this sort of thing that everyone's passion project wants to hinge on. We need better public transport infrastructure. We need a stadium. We need, we're thinking about housing. It sort of becomes everyone wanting to put their eggs in the Olympic basket.
Well, I mean, bear in mind, it's only $5 billion. I mean, economists
pocket change.
Toss these numbers off if $5 billion is not a lot of money, given that most of it has to be spent on running a big sporting event. So you can use it as a hook for issues like inclusivity. You can make sure that the housing is something which does good for which presumably will still be around in 8 years' time, housing crisis. That's worked in some Olympics, not so well in others. So there's stuff we can do, but in general, the best way to think about this is one really big sporting event. The biggest most of us will see in our lives is really here in Brisbane.
Look, I agree, because there is a lot of talk about legacy. Yeah. And so we really talk up the importance of the Games as somehow transforming society, all the legacy of what we want it to be, where we want inclusivity and parity and people to have the same opportunities. Unfortunately, society is not equal, that some people are much more disadvantaged than others. And so the expectation that the Games can actually change kind of broader social, political, economic circumstances of people is no wonder that there's a failure to live up to the dream. And I think what John's expressing is an opportunity to say, actually, this is a 4-week event, and people could have a really good time. Some people will have a better time than others. Some people will be significantly impacted or unable to participate. The cost will be prohibitive. They live too far out. They won't benefit. But if we can, at the very least, make sure that the impacts and the consequences, the negative consequences of the Games are diminished, then any hope that it can do more than give people a good time, I think becomes a really unrealistic set of expectations. And it's no wonder people become demoralised with it and disillusioned and think, actually, this is something that we don't want in our nation.
I mean, I think that's a very good point, Linda, and I agree with both what you and John have said, but I think that it is an opportunity, and I think that the difference, not the difference, but the thing here and one of the challenges and the opportunities is that from the announcement in 2021 to when we hold the Games, we really had that 11-year window. We still have 8 years, so a 12-year-old today will be 20 when the Olympics are held. Now that's a pretty formative period in someone's life. So to have that sort of thinking, well, yes, this is coming in 2032, and I agree that the weeks of the event, the lead up, the activity is great. But I think there is a lot of thinking that's happening, and I think a lot of people haven't. The document that was prepared, Elevate 2042, which is the legacy document prepared by the Australian Olympic Commission, and that involves substantial consultation, substantial research and review, and it is a comprehensive document that I encourage people, if they haven't looked at it, to look at it, because it does set a pathway, and it recognises that the Olympics is not going to solve housing, the Olympics is not going to solve juvenile issues, but if it can just be a point in a focus point, or something which gives something a position in their terms of reference of their life.
So, certainly, I think a great thing for young people aspiring to sport. I see ads saying, "Girls, do you want to play rugby in 2032?" So that's something. Yeah, and Australia is a society that can take more advantage of that than a lot of places where especially participation in sport is much less. I think. I mean, the US is sports mad, but they watch a specialised cast of people play sports. Whereas in Australia, I think there really is something to it that any young person can dream of being at the Olympics.
And I think it's obviously that dream of the Olympics, but it's that broader issue of community health, that's sort of being a catalyst for encouraging people just to be more active. I mean, as much as I'd like to be an Olympic distance runner, I would never, no matter how much I train, I could never be an Olympic distance runner. But to say, well, yeah, I might just do a little bit more exercise, and that sort of platform, I think, is something that, and as you say, John, Australia is already a relatively high participation sporting nation, and if this can sort of help that, and I know that one of the legacies is about community health, community participation, inclusion, and one of the things about the Olympics, and I no doubt we'll talk more about facilities and stadiums, but there is a lot of investment that can go towards enhancing community sport, community participation and grassroots area.
I am curious. Well, I'm looking forward to bumping Simone Biles off her perch. I joined the gymnastics team in 2032. But Linda, so you're a sociologist. What do we know about Olympics and community sport participation?
So there's actually little evidence to suggest that an elite event like the Olympics does encourage people to take up sport when they didn't do before. So that is one thing. I think, and being a sociologist, we do look at very broad structures and we really focus on inequality. So I might be the negative one in the group where I'm going, yeah, but it can't do this and this doesn't happen. But if we look at the past performance, there is no evidence that it improves participation. And what we need to make sure of is that whatever we do to build venues and invest in in elite sports, we don't undermine local community participation. And so there have been cases in the past, for example, with the London Olympics, that there were local community facilities that were disrupted and knocked down to make place for expansion in stadiums, local playing fields and sporting fields. And in fact, I think some of the evidence from London is that community sports participation has actually reduced since the Olympics. And that's partly because of cost of living. It costs money to join sports clubs and participate in, if you think about sports like archery, for example, where you need the equipment. So I think, to take a positive spin on the Olympics, I think it can be a catalyst for change. But I think what we need to look at is to make sure that the broad values and vision for this mega event, we don't rely on trickle-down impacts to local communities and think that by watching or being able to attend the Olympics, people will suddenly start taking up sport. We need to think about what are some of the kind of broader demographic factors that impact upon people's health and well-being in sport, and how do we use the vision of the Olympics to address some of those, which is, of course, cost of living, getting people moving, healthy feeding, walkable neighbourhoods, fresh produce being available. Those are the things that are important, I think, to people's health and well-being, not the presence of an elite event like the Olympics.
Peter, how do you plan for that?
Well, I think it's the point that Linda's made. You need to sort of consider what are the elements that make give people the opportunity to have a successful life, in terms of successful being that they have access to housing, they have access to sort of public transport, to open space. I mean, it shouldn't be that complicated, and in principle it's not. And relatively we are very fortunate here in Australia, but we do have issues and challenges as we're experiencing at the moment. So I think in terms of our planning processes, I mean, we have a lot of planning processes in Australia, both from a national, a state, a local level. And we have some very good people sort of looking to work on sort of planning our communities and our cities so that they do have this access to all of those necessary things. So I think the principles are there. It's the challenge is, and John, the economist, will comment, how we afford what all our aspirations are, where we spend our money most appropriately. I think there's a recognition that within South East Queensland we need to do more on our public transport so that people have access, so that if you live somewhere, you know, in a location that you're not restricted in terms of access to community activities or sporting activities. So this was one of the aspirations of the Olympic Games. I think there's still a genuine desire, but some of the cost elements of putting that in place. Housing, we're obviously having the housing debate at the moment, and this one of the issues is that we need a greater diversity of housing, and I think there's a recognition that the days of just our housing being dominated by detached housing on individual lots will still be one of our elements of our housing, but the opportunity, because households are changing in size, the more greater density, the diversement in terms of our open space, our walkable communities. So making sure that our places, and this once again is something that we should be working towards as a community, and I believe we are. Whether we're doing it as well as we'd like to, we still have to go forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think a general point, which I mean hasn't come up as much as I feared, is
give me time.
Is a lot of the time projects like this are sold on the basis of job creation, whereas the last thing we need is to create more jobs for carpenters, bricklayers, and so forth. If they've already got jobs building houses, the last thing we want is to have them building things we don't need. And I mean, I think, well, although of course this isn't strictly relevant, you're building a new stadium in Hobart and saying, isn't this great for creating jobs? You sort of think, well, I bet there's a lot of homeless people in Hobart who would far rather have a house than a new stadium for a football team.
So speaking of stadiums and speaking of sort of what we build and what we do with it, we did get a lot of questions from people about stadium plans, what the best stadium plan for Brisbane would be, which I'd love Peter to comment on, but also broadly, what previous Olympics have taught us about where the maybe pitfalls are here.
Did you want to go first?
Well, I mean,
you go first, and then
certainly. I mean, the record of the previous Olympics is pretty grim. I think you could do a tour
from an economic
Athens. Yeah, well, you don't even really need economics here. Just go and visit Athens or Beijing or Atlanta, and say, "I'd like to see the stadium."
Melbourne.
And the answer is, well, look, I'm sorry. In Beijing it's there and it's beautiful, but you certainly could get a guided tour.
That's all there is.
So the record has been pretty poor. I think we are, and of course that's one of the reasons that we were the sole bidder. So I think we are starting from a more realistic position than the grandiose hopes of some of those other places.
Yeah, I think that the point John made, so there have been some clear examples where facilities were built that were not going to be fully utilised or used. One of the once again, advantages we have in Australia is that the demand for our major stadiums, I mean, there might be some discussions about Homebush in Sydney, but here in Brisbane, if as we were talking earlier, do we believe that AFL is going to be around for the next 50 years in Australia and in Brisbane in particular? I'd think you'd say yes. Is cricket going to be a national sport? You'd say yes. Does Brisbane need a world-class oval round stadium? You'd say pretty well yes. We've got a world-class rectangular stadium at Suncorp Stadium, which is very heavily utilised and very active. The Gabba is quite actively utilised. So you'd have to say that if you could have access to, and there's a long way to go still just to finalise that, but a stadium well considered, well built in Australia shouldn't be left out as something that's not being utilised. If we've got anyone from Townsville sort of on the call tonight, if anyone's been to the Country Bank Stadium in Townsville, which was built, Townsville had a stadium which was outside the central city, was a challenge to sort of get to, was still supported and patronised. They built a new stadium close to the central city, close to transport, close to activity. That stadium, if you go there on 20 weeks or 25 weeks of the year when it's being utilised, is an active, throbbing part of the city. So stadiums, can be, if they're well considered and well located. The Melbourne Cricket Ground, which served as the Melbourne Olympics, and that centre there. So I think in Brisbane, and the debate has been a little bit much about the major stadium, but there's a lot of other investments that are happening in terms of at Chandler, at other places in Moreton Bay, on the Gold Coast, other facilities, to Linda's point, that will be part of the community sport and those activities.
And I think that's really one of the benefits of Brisbane. One of the positive sides is there is a real focus on using existing infrastructure and upgrading it, because one of the big things, the legacy items that we see from Olympics, is that it really focuses on urban regeneration. And that seemed to be a really good thing for the city, that formerly brownfield sites or low-income areas are now replaced with new housing. They're shiny. They're the places that attract people, kind of designer boutiques and shops. And that can be really beneficial for people who move to those areas. But it also has a tendency to displace existing populations. There's evidence that houses are demolished to make room for new apartments, that gentrification happens where the cost of the neighbourhood and the cost of houses increases. And I think that's going to be less of an issue in Brisbane because the infrastructure already exists, because where they're going to put the Athletes Village, for example, at Hamilton North Shore is already a kind of an industrial space that's being developed. So while I'm not persuaded it's really going to do much to address the housing situation, other than for people who can afford $1.52+ million apartments, I think the displacement of an existing community is going to be less of an issue for this particular Olympics than we've seen with many others, where there is literally the demolition of entire neighbourhoods to transform them.
It's worth pointing out, Expo was a big success in those respects. It was a largely derelict area, and we did put Brisbane at least on the Australian map in a way that wasn't before as well. So we have had one success, and they tend to be the exception rather than the rule. I think if you look at particularly the car race events, they attract relatively small crowds. I don't think have any of those indirect benefits to claim for them.
That's right. And I think some of the big stadiums in London that they built for the Olympics, in thinking about accessibility, they're not particularly walkable. So the people who live near them then have to face, large roads and motorways in order to get to them. So they're not embedded and infiltrated in the community and then become a community resource in the way that I think some of our facilities are in Brisbane and South East Queensland already. Peter?
Yeah, no, I think that they're both very good points. I mean, Linda's point about we're fortunate in Brisbane that we don't have a lot of areas that require that are blighted areas in our city. So we've had areas that are going through renewal over time, the South Brisbane West End, the New Farm. What's important for our sort of Olympic aspiration was this making sure that the areas outside the central city are not forgotten, that the transport, the housing, the community sort of engagement happened in a broader area. And that certainly was the original intent, and I think still is the ambition of the legacy.
So one of the questions, so I said that we've gotten a lot of questions about stadium specifically, and one question from Christine is acknowledging the fact that Brisbane has a long and unflattering record of, I think she means not protecting its heritage, architecture and character, and how can the community be given a say in what happens to their city? Who wants to jump on that?
Well, I mean, we have had some unfortunate incidents in sort of, hotels in George Street sort of that were demolished in the night. We've probably
Past that.
got better, and so the protection of our heritage assets, there's pretty strong heritage legislation in play. I mean, she may be referring that there is around, if the Gabba was in play for whatever reason for a future, the school and then the sort of the old police station, they're protected as heritage assets. So I think there's a recognition that we're not going to see anything which is detrimental to sort of heritage aspects in terms of the Olympics won't be responsible for that.
Can I just raise the issue of the East Brisbane School? Because I think, as you say, it's important to maintain our heritage, and I think had the expansion of the Gabba gone ahead, I think there was it was built into the plan to preserve the building. Yep. But I think for the community, it's about the function and the purpose, and that this is a school and this is the heart of the community. And so I think as difficult it is, how do you make a decision between a very large and important stadium that will be used for many, many decades for key sporting events and the needs of a small local community? I do think sometimes erring on the side of the community, that's how you bring them along. Yeah. And I think losing critical infrastructure like a school and a local park, that's when you stop bringing the community along. And the people that speak out about that, I think, they're not a noisy minority. They are the local community who are going to be most affected. So I think it was a really good decision to listen to the community about that school and to rethink that. And I don't know if it's off the table completely, but I think listening to the community is a really critical part of bringing the community on board.
Yeah, I think also, I think there is a different elite aspect of it. The people who were pushing in on the original decision had a personal interest in leaving a legacy which is not the same as the community interest. And as they departed the scene, we could say, actually, this is way too expensive and damaging. And I think with other kinds of events, like the heads of government type meetings, they're just imposed on the community. Again, the Lord Mayor or whoever thinks isn't this great, but
this will be my legacy.
But for the average member of the community, having the Commonwealth heads of government or the G20 meet here is 100% dead loss with no offsetting benefits at all.
So remember, you can ask your questions by submitting them by the Q&A box. We are going to have time for questions at the end, and I'm peppering them throughout as well when I can. And on engaging with the public, Peter, you mentioned before the Elevate 2042 document, which the plan is a lot more thought out and explicit than I think we get the impression of through what we hear in the news about division.
Yeah. Yeah, no, as I said, there's a lot of great work that's been done by a lot of people around and a lot of engagement with community, and a lot of people have been involved. It's like any event, the news grab and big news. And,
Sorry.
And no disrespect to the news industry and the journalist industry. They've got to make it news and make the debate. So I think this is one of the advantages and disadvantages we've had in terms of time. So there's enough time for the debate to happen. And it's probably good to have the debate. It's great that we can. But there is a lot of good work that's being done. There's people who are very committed to making sure that this event wasn't, while it is about the month of the Olympics and the Paralympics, but it is about the decade after and the decade leading into it. So as I said, I encourage people not to sort of lose hope in what is happening. There's a lot of great work still happening. A lot of very dedicated bureaucrats are working hard on things. A lot of sporting organisations are working hard on things. So there's a lot of great work happening that, and to John's point, I'm sure Brisbane will deliver a wonderful Olympics. It'll be different. We're not Paris, we're not Tokyo, we're not Beijing, but we are Brisbane, and we've got a lot to look forward to. And we will have some great assets and some great facilities that will be be legacy. The Brisbane Arena has been sort of played around, but we will finish up with an indoor arena close to the central city that will host an amazing swimming event during the Olympics, and there'll be a great facility after that for the area. We will also have enhanced swimming facilities out at our Chandler and places like that for the community. I mean, that out at the Sleeman Centre at Chandler is used by over a few million people a year for a variety of community events. And so it's heavily utilised. That's getting enhanced and improved. The sporting arena at Moreton's Bay City. So there's a lot happening that will be there for people.
John, you kind of casually tossed out the number 5 billion before as if it was just, I'm guessing you just got it in your pocket. Where does that money come from, and what's the return to South East Queensland on that investment?
Sure. Well, I mean, some of it's going to be covered by ticket sales. That's the gross. There's ticket sales and TV. But there'll still be a lot left over coming from largely the state of Queensland. Yep. So, I mean, look at those numbers, and every one of us is probably going to end up paying several $100s a head. And what we get for that is civic pride, the opportunity to go to the Olympics. It's think of it as one gigantic river fire.
Yeah, right.
And it's an arguable case. Should we do this? Yeah, we have other priorities, but there's no reason why we can't, if we're willing to pay for it, say this is a good thing. And of course, we've paid the bill now, or at least we've signed up for the bill now, so we should enjoy it.
Is that a good use of our funds, Linda?
Oh gosh.
I mean, from a social perspective, like what?
Look, I think it's about, there's only so much money available to support all of the priorities we have. So it is about prioritisation, and of course, whatever we spent, aside from the money generated from tourism and ticket sales, which we wouldn't be generating were it not for that event, I think any resources that go towards supporting the Olympics will have to be taken away from some other priority. And I think, of course, the one that we all think about is housing. We're already having a housing affordability crisis. We call it a crisis, but it's actually been in the making for decades. So it's not like we didn't see this coming. And there are a lot of promises and a lot of presumed investment in housing, and including in social housing. But we know, for example, that the building of that housing is really slow, because it's not just about the money; it's about the resources and the staff, the workers to actually undertake the construction. And at the moment, the construction industry is very busy with the rail project, with other infrastructure projects. Then we're going to kind of redeploy them, I think, to the Olympics. So is it worth it? Certainly for some people, it's absolutely going to be worth it. We'll get civic pride, we'll go to the Olympics. If I live in a really nice house in the city, I can probably rent it out for exorbitant price to somebody else. My house price will probably go up if I live in an area like Hamilton, North Shore, because there'd be increased demand. I might even be able to afford a few tickets and get to see some events. But who misses out? And the people who miss out are the people who are missing out now. And they are people who are disadvantaged, they're marginalised. What are we going to do about homeless people? It's one thing to be building this athletes' village, but that doesn't address homelessness. And I think the expectation that 5% of the athletes' village will be converted into social housing alongside affordable housing, and then market rents and purchase. But even affordable housing these days is below market rent. And we know what market rents are like at the moment, and they're not affordable to many people. So my fear of the Olympics is that most of us, probably the four of us sitting here, are going to have a fine old time we'll enjoy it and then it will be over and then we'll go back to our lives. Whereas other people's lives, they're going backwards and there's not much in the Olympics for them right now, and they're invisible.
Yeah, unless we use that opportunity to, you've raised a very good point, Linda. But as I say, I keep coming back. I think there is an awareness, and there was an intent and a desire that the Olympics would not just be about that month of activity, but about the real legacy. And I think there is a recognition of the challenge of housing, the challenge of inclusiveness, and this is where we've got to work harder to get it right, and we've got to bring the community. I mean, unfortunately, we get caught up in political debate, and we've got debate happening at the moment. We've got elections coming in Queensland, and whatever happens there, the election will be over, and then perhaps just a recognition that now we need just to move forward, whatever happens, and sort of because the thinking and the planning is there, and $5 billion is a significant amount of money and can't be wasted. It's got to be of benefit. But in terms of an investment over the next 50 or 60 years for Queensland, when you look at the state budget of what we spend, if it's spent wisely or has a sort of attenuation that gives some benefit, then I think we've got to work towards that.
Yeah, I mean, an important economic principle is what we can do, we can afford. So the issue really is the resources, the skilled resources for building and mobilising those in a way that we're not succeeding in doing very well, and that reflects a lot of different things that are wrong with our housing market and the withdrawal of the government from social housing and things of that kind. And the Olympics themselves can't change that, but they can certainly catalyse, and I think are contributing to a conversation which is increasingly saying, we've gone the wrong way, and saying, look, the private market is going to handle all of this.
Yeah,
that's right.
And this is not a big, it's a small public housing project in a place where, which when we need a lot of public housing projects, but at least it's sort of getting away from the assumption that, look, all we need to do is keep on having more home buyer schemes and things of this kind, and we'll solve the problem.
So before we go to questions, we've got a few more minutes just to discuss, and I'd really love to look at what a realistic timeline, what a realistic kind of roadmap looks like to get us there, because as we have mentioned a couple of times, it was announced when we had 11 years to go, heaps of time, it's all going to be fine. Now we're 8 years out. Peter, how long does it take to get an Olympics together?
Well, I think we are getting an Olympics together. I mean, and I think people, I mean, the focus has been on the main stadium, whatever the main stadium is, but there are a lot of things happening. There are, contracts that are being worked on now for facilities and activities outside of the main stadium. There's programs being worked through. So there's a lot happening. And the team working on the sort of organisation with Cindy Hook and sort of and Andrew Liveris and his team, there's a lot of excellent work being taken place. So we do have plenty of time. We can't waste time, and we want to get the maximum out of it. Even under the original proposal, I think people sometimes forget that even if you're talking about the original Gabba proposal, the actual, if the Gabba was to have been demolished, it wasn't going to start demolition until the end of 2025, the last ball in the Ashes test of 2025. So that's still over a year away under that original scenario. So that's to one side now. But the actual physical construction of a main stadium, we've got plenty of time. I mean, cities normally only have 5 or 6 years. We've still got 8 years. So there's plenty of time. What's important is that we do all of these things, and we do look at our legacy strategy, and we do plan so that we can make it a more inclusive community, a more accessible community, a greener community. And I as I said, I don't want to sound like I'm being overly sort of positive about it, but there is a lot of activity and good things happening. And it's important that people are challenged. I mean, it's important that the news people, the journalists ask the hard questions, and people are saying, well, is this value for money? So we're lucky that we're in a society where we can have that debate and people can value their opinions, and it keeps everyone on notice.
So I don't agree with Peter.
Nice.
Yeah.
But having said that, I don't think the Olympics can achieve all that, but I don't think it should.
Okay.
You know, and I think, again, if we go back to John's point about this being an event for 4 weeks, what we want is an event that doesn't impact too detrimentally on people who are already struggling. If we're left with this wonderful legacy of some good sporting events, a bit more housing at Hamilton North Shore, then I'm comfortable with that. But what I really want to see is an inclusive society, not just an inclusive Olympics. And to put any expectation on the committee or the planners to achieve a truly inclusive society is actually a really unfair expectation. But if it's a catalyst to encourage us to do what needs to be done, then I think that's a starting conversation.
And that's the Elevate 2042 is about that. It's not about the 4 weeks.
That's
it's about
right.
the before and beyond and the decade after. So I think they are.
You could have the Elevate document without the Olympics. I think it's having a plan for the region, for the kind of future that we want. I think that's a good document for that. But there needs to be really broad political will, and we need to start with the basics of what an inclusive society looks like before we can just pin it on the Olympics.
I want to say another thing about the Gabba story, and it's that one of the big dangers with any policy of this kind is it becomes used as a trump card. And so the trump card was, we have to have, as somebody said in 2000, the best Olympics ever. And on any plausible basis, we probably won't have the best Olympics ever. We've decided we're going to put on Olympic Games that we can live with, and we're not going to be railroaded into stuff we don't want on the basis of the people, on the basis of the wishes of the proponents, the sports bureaucrats and the people who want to make this a really big legacy defining event have to say, no, well, the legacy has to be a legacy we want, not a legacy that will cement your name in history.
It's time for some questions. If you've got a question, you can put it in the Q&A box wherever you're watching this. But a few people have already come through, and Mark is asking, how can the state and the city better coordinate efforts to support the Olympics? Can the ugly politics between the two be reconciled in time? Peter?
Yeah, I mean, we do tend to see just the sort of argy-bargy. There is activities that are happening, that a dialogue is occurring. Yeah, obviously the city sometimes has some interests, the state has broader interests. But to Mark's question, I think, and once we have got the delivery authority still being sort of finalised and still to be structured, perhaps before the state election. So once again, I say don't dismay. There is still a lot of discussion, and both on both sides of the city and the state, people are desirous of a good outcome. They might be slightly nuanced or different in some of their thinking, but I don't think anyone's there deliberately trying to say we don't want this to be a good outcome. So people approach it from slightly different positions, but once again, what I see is people genuinely trying to get a good outcome, and we will get to a resolution and a go forward.
So someone's asked, is there anything from the Paris Games, good or bad, that you think Brisbane should take particular notice of? No notes.
Oh, good or bad?
I mean, it was a wonderful opening ceremony, but as someone said, and talking to some people who were there, if you're a spectator on an opening ceremony like that, your visibility is limited.
It's like the Queen waving as she drives by.
That's right. And if you don't have access to a big screen to watch it all, I mean, it's a great. I mean, only the French could pull that off in a city like Paris, and it was wonderful to watch on TV.
Well, so someone else has asked, what are your thoughts on using the Brisbane River for the opening ceremony?
I think it might have been Adrian. Adrian Trina said, well, remember the Brisbane River is twice as wide as the Seine, so think of the logistics even further.
I know, triathlons in the Brisbane River. Okay, there's one. There's one lesson to learn.
Well, fortunately, we have plenty of lovely spots to hold the triathlon thing, so that's.
I think the wonderful things that Paris is doing is using some of its natural facilities, and once Brisbane is not Paris, but we have some magnificent structures, we have some beautiful landscapes, some activities. So I think we can sell off our beauty and our opportunities in a uniquely Brisbane way. So I think it is about using your natural and your own assets as best you can.
Well, sorry, Linda, you go.
The only other thing I was going to think about is how to embed the Olympics in everyday life. So rather than suspend everyday life while the Olympics goes on, for example, one of the things in Paris at the moment is that all the local businesses were prepped, ready for this huge influx of tourists, and people can't dine in there because they've got QR codes and they can't get in. So that level of detail is really important to make sure that everybody benefits rather than just, like I said, thinking about that trickle-down economics, that somehow we're going to have all these tourists with all this money and local businesses and restaurants will benefit just by their presence. Well, not if you're blocking off roads and not if you're using particular access codes for people to even get into the area.
The general story is almost as much as is displaced as is attracted.
Yeah.
So, in some cases more so. I think, as I again with the car races, I think there's actually a net negative.
That's right. And there are some people who expect to be, disadvantaged by this, or and certainly they're going to find it an inconvenience. But the promises that we make to local businesses, for example, we need to live up to those promises, because they're probably putting a lot of staff and a lot of planning, not having their holidays during that time to be there, and then to find that that's not a peak economic experience for them, I think is the height of disappointment.
You mentioned before, Peter, our natural resources and environment in southeast Queensland, and Ray is asking, are there representatives from the natural environment on the Olympic Planning Committee? And my interpretation of that question is, what are the green credentials of the Olympics? How do we ensure that we're not harming the environment by holding it?
Yeah, well, certainly, I mean, in terms of all the work that's being done in the legacy, there's been a lot of engagement with the environmental and green groups and the sort of natural habitat groups. So I think there is a very strong recognition of the making sure that this is a green games and not just a green in a sort of superficial, but in a true sense, which is very aspirational.
Is it possible to have, I mean, honestly, people flying from all over the world, the amount of the construction, the disposable, it's just such a volume experience.
It is a challenge, and I mean, there's a lot of bright minds working on it. From the University of Queensland, it's got a lot of people working on the whole circular economy and sustainable city. So that's another aspect of what the Olympics, once again, it's not the only reason why, but the Olympics is driving a lot of research into sustainability and sort of their circular economy. So some people would say it's aspirational, and it is a challenge, but there is certainly a strong focus on it in terms of how that can be done to be carbon positive, sort of as a game. So,
John?
Well, I mean, in terms of timing, one of the interesting issues is we're on the verge of green steel and green concrete, but whether we could, I mean, that would be a huge achievement, I must say, as a demonstration if we could do that. Green steel, I think, is probably a possibility. Green concrete, maybe, 2036 might have been a better target there, but that would certainly be something. I mean, I don't think offsetting airline flights is going to cut it anymore. So, if we could actually get the construction aspect done in a green way, even at a somewhat higher cost, it would certainly be a striking demonstration.
That's a very good point, John.
Keep your questions coming via the Q&A box. Gay's asked a question that was also asked by a fair few people in the pre-submitted questions about how First Nations people are engaged in the Olympic preparations. Linda, do you know?
Look, I'm not going to pretend to speak for First Nations people, but and I read the Elevate document, and so the focus on First Nations people and their inclusion, economic opportunities is very much there. I guess the only thing I would say, and this goes back again to ensuring that the Olympics is embedded within broader social political context and not some kind of isolated bubble, is that the effects of the failed referendum to the voice to Parliament is still really key for First Nations people. And, the conversations we're having now about where we're going with Makarrata Commission, about the truth-telling and treaty and closing the gap that's what's important. And what I wouldn't like to see is the kind of the cultural appropriation of First Nations culture and kind of dance and performance and the visual imagery that we see without that ongoing commitment to truth-telling and treaty. And I think it would be disingenuous of us to try and have one without the other. And I worry about the direction where we're going with Indigenous affairs, and yet, you know, kind of bringing Indigenous culture into the Olympics, I think, is not really what the country needs.
Anything you'd add there, Peter Roger?
No, I think Linda's captured it very. I mean, I can't speak on behalf, but I think there has been a genuine effort to engage, but it's obviously got to be more of an engagement. It's got to be the ownership by the First Nations people of what they see as the opportunity that might come out of this and how it can best benefit their aspirations. And so there's obviously still a journey to go, but hopefully there is, I know there is at least engagement and dialogue happening, and hopefully it continues and deepens.
So this is something we touched on a little bit throughout, but someone's asked about how the Olympics may encourage construction and improvement of existing public transport within Brisbane, especially connecting with neighbouring tourist areas, for example, the Sunshine Coast, which I know you have a vested interest in.
I certainly do. Yeah, so I mean, certainly it provides. I mean, we're promised in large billboards a heavy rail by 2032. So I mean, it certainly provides a convenient hook to hang ideas like that on, and it does. A major event like this does stress the importance of public transport. That if we try to do this with cars, it would be a complete disaster. I don't know what Los Angeles is going to do actually, but they'll probably manage somehow. But yeah, so it does provide a hook for these kinds of things of saying this is a huge public event, and only a strong public sector, public transport and so forth can deliver that. Of course, that doesn't solve the question of paying for and finding the workers for building the rail line, but it does I think emphasise the importance of that, as opposed to going on Coronation Drive in our cars.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, I think once again, it shouldn't be the only reason we sort of build public transport, and I think that the challenge with public transport is probably, and John's much better qualified than me on this, but it's almost impossible to get a business case to stack up on any sort of public transport. It should just almost be built. We should just have a policy.
Yeah, but certainly a business case is not the way to think about it. That's right. I mean, there is an economic case, but not a business case.
Yeah, so rail to the Sunshine Coast hopefully is at least one outcome that might be incentivised by the Olympics. But improvement in our general public transport, the active transport, our cycling, our walking. All of those should be outcomes, hopefully.
One more. Oh, sorry, John, did you have something there?
Well, just I mean, we haven't. I mean, there's a national policy issue, but active transport hasn't made it into the transport agenda, and the Olympics might provide a teensy little push in that direction for state policy, which would be a good thing.
One last question from someone who's asking, and I don't know if they mean this in a good way or a bad way. Will there still be some vestige of the big country town feel? Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
I think that's gone. I mean, I first came to Brisbane 30 years ago, 50 years ago. I was still alive. And it definitely was a big country town, even coming from Canberra. I don't see that there's anything left of that.
Canberra's the original big country town.
Canberra's quite, I mean, Canberra has its own special thing. But no, Brisbane, well, that's the thing. I think it's much more the Barcelona story. It's a place which still, if you're old enough and haven't updated your priors in Australia, still have that kind of memory of last century. And I guess if you're outside Australia, you've heard of Sydney and Melbourne, not Brisbane. So I think there will be, it will, as I say, we, unlike most places that have held the Olympics, we will get a bit of a recognition of, yes, this is actually a major world city with a leading first world university and all the things you would expect to have in a major city. And very few of the things you would expect to have in a country town, like everyone knowing everyone else and all of those kinds of things.
I agree. I think, look, Brisbane wants to position itself as a world city. It's never going to be a global city, but it wants to be a world city. But I think I'm not from here, So I'm able to kind of look at it a bit objectively. And I think that notion of it being a country town, I don't know about that, but we still have something like the Ekka, where people literally bring the country into the city. So it's this kind of hybrid of, of its history, of where it wants to go. And I think that's actually part of Brisbane's appeal. It will move and develop and become more outward focus, and I think that's a good thing. But there are always remnants of what it used to be, and that's part of its charm. And that's why we don't live in Sydney and Melbourne.
Yeah. And I think if there's one thing about what Brisbane wants to be, is it a welcoming, inclusive city. And sort of if by a country town we say that everyone can come here and feel that they're welcome and opportunity to start. Yeah. So I think that's what we want to continue to have as a city and as a ethos of our way of life.
And I also think to some extent the day of the global city has passed. That the global city was really something to do with the financial sector. London was the leading global city, but now it's the capital of an isolated country. It's no the idea of London.
We just lost the British shoes.
That's right.
As the idea of London,
kind of global nodes
as great global
and
cities.
flows,
Now they're just another couple of big cities, no different from any other big city, I think, and we're a medium-sized version of that.
Yeah.
So in terms of sort of coming to the end of our chat, if you had one piece of advice to the organisers of Brisbane 2032 based on your own experience, what would it be, Linda?
Don't forget the community. Think about everyday life and how you can ensure that continues or is improved at the end of the event. And think about people who are already hidden and marginalised, and make sure that we don't entrench their marginalisation in the process.
Peter?
Yeah, I think Linda's made excellent points, but I think just look at what this will contribute beyond, and sort of and plan accordingly, and also handle the communication. Make sure that the community is along on the journey, but understands what you're seeking to do and to deliver.
Well, more or less the same. Focus on making it as good an experience as possible for the people of Brisbane and the region and Australia as a whole, but really the benefits and the costs are going to be borne here. The visitors can come, they'll go, that's fine, but it really the people here who will pay the costs of it and will enjoy most of the benefits.
Well, we are going to have to leave it there for tonight. Thank you so much to our panellists, Linda, John and Peter, for sharing their expertise with us. And thank you for joining us. We really appreciate having so many alumni join us from all around the world for these events. And we look forward to seeing you throughout the year for more UQ talks, both online and in person. So keep an eye on your inbox for those invitations. But for now, good night.